Welcome. I'm delighted to see so many folks here. Again, my name is Quinn Meekum. I'm the coordinator for Middle East Studies, and we're really delighted to have Professor Wendy Pearlman here. Wendy Pearlman is an associate professor of political science and the director of undergraduate studies in political science at Northwestern University. Wendy and I overlapped for a year at Harvard many years ago, and since that time she's gone on and done a lot of great things, and I'm excited that she's going to be with us today. Professor Pearlman studies the comparative politics of the Middle East, social movements, conflict processes, and she does a kind of political science that I think will resonate with many of you. She studies emotion, she studies social networks and the effects of social change. She's done a lot of work on the Arab-Israeli conflict and is the author of 4 books. I think it's probably worth telling you what they are. Her first book is Occupied Voices, Stories of Everyday Life from the Second Intifada, which again takes a narrative, story-based approach to understanding what was happening in the early 2000s in Palestine and Israel under the Second Intifada. Her second book is titled Violence, Nonviolence in the Palestinian National Movement. Her third book, which is the subject of her talk today, is We Crossed a Bridge and It Trembled, Voices from Syria. And she even has a recent book that just came out this last year titled Triadic Coercion, Israel's Targeting of States That Host Non-State Actors. She is currently returning to the subject of the book that she'll be discussing today, interviewing displaced Syrians, and has a great number of contacts in the Syrian diaspora and has done really quite a remarkable job in helping to translate and help us understand the human aspects of one of the worst civil wars of this century. So please join me in welcoming Wendy Pearlman to BYU.
Thank you so much for that really lovely introduction, and I've literally just rushed in the building, I think about 5 or 6 minutes ago. So my heart is beating fast, but this seeing a friend in the audience and the lovely prayer introduction have calmed my nerves, but I just realized that I'm not sure I turned my own phone off, so hold on just one second. It came in so fast. Yeah, and I did. Perfect. Okay, so then we can get started. So again, thank you so much for having me here. So to give a little bit of background, I started studying the Middle East during a college semester abroad in Morocco in the mid-1990s. So for others of you who have studied abroad or are thinking about it, it was life-changing for me, as I'm sure for so many others. And I continued studying Middle East politics, the politics of the Arab world, studying Arabic language for many years, until 2011, when these huge protests went out throughout the Middle East that we came to call the Arab Spring. So like many regional specialists, but probably all of you who are old enough to remember, it was a captivating, euphoric moment of people's power, of people going out into the streets to say, enough, we want change, we want to live with freedom and dignity. And at that time, many eyes began to turn towards Syria, where both Syrians themselves and others of us who study the region, like Professor Meekum and myself, were thinking, Syria is a kingdom of silence. The regime is too strong. The military is infused with the regime. The people have been intimidated by a history of silence. Others throughout the region might go out and rebel, but not in Syria. They'll be the last to protest. So when Syrians defied those expectations, and they also went out to protest, first in tens and then hundreds and eventually hundreds of thousands and millions, I really wanted to know how and why and what was pushing them, how this was transforming them as individuals, how this would transform their country and the course of history. And I figured that there was no better way to find out how and why and what was motivating people than to talk to them themselves. And that began what has now been 7 years of interviewing Syrians wherever I can find them. I began in a summer in Jordan in 2012, basically starting with one contact and then coming to interview every Syrian I could find as one person introduced me to another and so on, and then continued on. I returned to Jordan, I went on to Turkey, to Lebanon. As the large wave of Syrian refugees moved on to Europe, I also began doing interviews and have done so to this day. Largely because it was already at that time too dangerous, at least for me, to go inside Syria and do interviews there, I began interviewing these displaced Syrians, people who'd left the country, and I could gather their stories. My interviews varied from short half-an-hour conversations to sometimes group discussions where several Syrians would speak with themselves, and I would be there with a tape recorder capturing the dialogue, to long oral histories where someone might talk about their entire life story, and that would unfold over hours or over days, and sometimes over years and continents, because as much as possible, I've tried to stay in touch with people and follow their journeys as they unfold. My interviewees varied by age and gender and hometown in Syria, ethnicity and religion, but the majority of people with whom I spoke identified as being against the regime of Bashar al-Assad, the government in Syria. And this was largely because I began with this special interest in protest, how and why people went out to protest the government, and my research networks always remained strongest among those who in some way identified with or supported the rebellion. So I can say the stories that I've collected over the years, as much as I've tried to work into different types of networks and social worlds, for the most part, I identify this part of the population, which in no way represents the full story of Syria, but I think represents a very important part of the population and a large part of the population that meets with too few opportunities to represent itself. Over the years that I collected these personal narratives, I gradually saw them coalesce into a collective narrative, a shared story of who people are and what they aspire to and what they want and have experienced. So the book that I'll be talking about today expresses that collective narrative. The introduction is in my voice, providing some basic context about the Syrian conflict, because I understand it can be bewilderingly confusing with all these different actors and events. So I try to break it down in more simple terms. And the rest of the book is exclusively in Syrians' words. It is a curation of excerpts of the testimonials that I collected. It goes name, story, name, story. Some as short as a sentence, some as long as several pages, arranged in an order to try to walk a reader through this story of the Syrian conflict, how it began, why it began, up until the present moment. So what I'd like to do today then is walk you through that general arc, to share some of these stories, to give you this sense of this sort of humanistic window on what the Syrian conflict is about. In the course of it, I'll try to touch a little bit about the events that are kind of raging in the news now, but I'd be happy to talk much more about that in the Q&A, because I know it's on many people's minds as it is on mine. But this will give you a sense of the larger context in which to insert these events that are happening now in northeast Syria. So to begin where the book begins, experiences of authoritarianism before 2011. So in 1970, after decades of coups and instability, General Hafez al-Assad seized power in Syria and established a strong authoritarian regime. He won some popularity, especially through politics of redistribution, offering services of education and healthcare and so forth, especially to rural and more peripheral communities, but allowed no space for criticism and threatened violence against those who dared to criticize. The Syrian stories I collected emphasize how this kind of threat of violence became a part of their everyday lives. This, for many, was best symbolized in the events of Hama in 1982, which Syrians sometimes whisper about as just the events, or the 1980s, which refers to after a period of years of gradually growing sort of opposition, the Muslim Brotherhood, which was the strongest opposition group in the country. Well, first offshoots of the Muslim Brotherhood began launching attacks, and the Muslim Brotherhood itself launched something of an armed insurrection in this town of Hama, and the regime came in with tanks, with troops, with aerial bombardment, flattened entire neighborhoods of the city, and killed up to tens of thousands, many of whom were civilians who had nothing to do with any sort of rebellion. But it sent a message to all, for generations, that this would be the potential violent response to those who dared to criticize this regime. So the stories that I've collected show how this kind of threat of violence became a part of people's everyday lives and their everyday subjectivities as individuals. How there was a sense that a single ruling political party, an omnipresent security apparatus, a pervasive network of covert informants, all combined to police society and encourage society to police itself. Let me share you some voices to give a sense of what that was like. Here are the words of Ilyas, a dentist from a village not too far from Hama City. And Ilyas told me, Syria had the appearance of being a stable country, but in my opinion, it wasn't real stability. Nobody trusted anyone else. People would say, don't talk, the walls have ears. It's a regime based on command and obedience. Every state institution recreated the same kind of power. The president had absolute power in the country. The principal of a school had absolute power in the school. At the same time, the principal is terrified. Of whom? Of the janitor sweeping the floor, because they're all government informants. This sense that you don't know who was listening, and anybody could be listening and report you to the government if you were seen to be critical, could be so internalized that some even talked about it as a kind of disposition to silence that stayed with people maybe even after they left the country. Let me share with you the words of Hussam, who left the Damascus suburbs as a kid in the 1980s, describing having other contact with Syrians who might be traveling outside the country in the 80s and the 90s, the 2000s. And he said, when you meet somebody coming out of Syria for the first time, you start to hear the same sentences. Everything is okay. Syria is a great country. The economy is doing great. It'll take him like 6 months, up to a year, to become a normal human being, to say what he thinks, what he feels. After all that time, even outside Syria, you feel that someone is recording. Bashar al-Assad, the son of Hafez al-Assad, came to power after his father's death in the year 2000. Syrians always like to say that the Syrian constitution at the time said that the president must be 40 years of age. The parliament quickly met to amend the constitution so 34-year-old Bashar could become president on his father's death. And many believed that this young, educated head of state would make reform, and he promised to be a reformer and a modernizer of the system. There was reform, most chiefly in the economic realm and the gradual shift from a state-dominated economy to more neoliberal market economy. Security rule and the threat of consequences for opposition remained, but these economic changes helped increase something that had also always been a part of the Syrian political landscape, and that's corruption and co-optation and the use of economic levers also to create stability in the system. And that sense of corruption was as frustrating for Syrians as much as anything else. Here, let me share with you the words of Iham, a web developer who would go on to be a web developer, but here he remembers as a child. And he said, even as an innocent child, you could see that the whole system just reeked. It fed on corruption and grew. If you want to get a passport, you have to bribe this guy or that guy. From when you're little, you're taught that this is the only way to survive in this country. As an active member of the ruling party, you're going to get better grades, better chances for better schools or jobs. Everything is handled by how loyal you are, and you're raised on the principle that you have to show that loyalty. For sure, there were transgressions. People stood up to power in ways big and small. But for most of the people I met, when they described these years, the backdrop to the current Syrian conflict, it was with a sense that corruption and repression simply limited the horizons of possibility. To hope for change seemed foolish. It simply was never going to happen. So why bother even thinking about it? To actually fight for change, reckless. It would probably only get you and also your family members in the worst kinds of danger, most chiefly represented in the threat of political imprisonment, sort of thrown in prison and for years or perhaps forever. So for many people, there was a sense, as expressed by the words of a drama student that opened my book, a Syrian citizen is just a number. Dreaming is not allowed. That is the backdrop to think about what 2011 meant for so many Syrians. It was daring to dream. So the book uses a series of anecdotes and reflections and memories to talk about how Syrians first began to hear about and follow the demonstrations in Tunisia and then in Egypt. They debated with themselves, would it happen here? Maybe yes, maybe no. And then there were a few tentative demonstrations that slowly got off the ground, that spread over space, that were sustained over time, and launched a national revolt that first called simply for reform of the given political system, changing some laws, dismissing some particularly corrupt governors and officials, and then gradually called for the collapse of the transformation of the full regime and political system. So I'd be happy to talk about those events and the mechanics of how an uprising happens, but here would like to focus on the human element of what protest meant for those who participated in it. And I think that's best captured in an expression that became ubiquitous in Syria, but really throughout the Arab world that fateful year, which is that people broke the barrier of fear. What came through in people's stories is that fear never disappeared, but people mustered the capacity to act through it, to act despite it. So for the theme of the seminar of walls and bridges, fear was a wall that people bridged or worked through, overcame by mustering the courage within themselves to go up and stand out for what they were convinced was right. Let me share you some stories to give you some sense of what that was like for at least a few individuals. So here's Shireen, a mother, and she told me, oppression was residing in us. It was part of our life. Like air, sun, water. We didn't even feel it. Like air is there, and you never ask, where is the air? And then, in 1 second, you blow it up. Don't even imagine that it was easy to go out to a demonstration. But still, this incredible oppression made us go out. I encouraged my nieces and nephews to come with me to demonstrations. I felt that if they didn't try that experience, they'd be missing the real meaning of life. When you chant, you shudder, and your body rises, and everything you imagine just comes out. Tears come down, tears of joy, because I broke the barrier. I am not afraid. I am a free being. Sadness and happiness and fear and courage, they're all mixed together in that voice, and it comes out strong. Before the revolution, Syria was just the place where I lived, but it didn't belong to me. When the revolution began, I discovered that Syria was my country. I'll pause there and note that Shireen, the woman who said these words, is actually, her family at least, is from the area in northeast Syria. She's Kurdish and from the Kurdish areas that are really under assault right now, to give you some complexity of identity and how people identify, perhaps as Kurds and also as Syrians and so forth. So this kind of sense from Shireen is one that I heard across the board from people of all different walks of life. Nearly everyone who participated in demonstrations identified it as an experience that was transformative. I'd asked people to describe their first demonstration, and what people usually said was, la tusif, it's simply indescribable. You can't put into words what it felt like. And I would say, I'm writing a book. I work in words. Can you try to describe it? And people would say things like, it was the first time I breathed, the first time I felt like a human. One man said, it was better than my wedding day. And when my wife heard that, she refused to speak to me for a month. This sense that it was like the first time, for me, is best captured in this passage I'll share from you, from Rima, who's a writer, who said, I was in a demonstration, and I started to whisper, freedom. And then I started to hear myself repeating, freedom, freedom, freedom. And then I started shouting, freedom. And I thought, this is the first time I have ever heard my own voice. And I told myself that I would never let anyone steal my voice again. This, I think, is what the Syrian uprising meant and means to those who championed it. But as we know, the Syrian story did not end there. Protests remained overwhelmingly peaceful for several months. The regime responded with different types of violence. The opposition took up arms. Those who did explain why they became part of an increasingly armed, militarized rebellion. Let me share with you the words of Captain, that's the nickname he goes by at least, who became a fighter with the Free Syrian Army. And he said, when demonstrations began, the security forces came. We agreed that if they were going to shoot bullets, then we needed weapons too, because of the blood. Blood is what moves people. Blood is the force of the revolution. As the armed rebellion expanded, the regime escalated its reprisals and use of all sorts of military means. Various state and non-state actors became involved with their own ideologies and goals, patrons and funding sources. The territory of the country began to fragment in this full-fledged, multi-sided, multi-dimensional war that continues until today, always mutating, came underway. So here to take a break from some stories to show some maps to give you some sense of the politics. So if you leave this slide feeling utterly confused, then you know you've got it, basically. So let's begin in the beginning. As I was saying, the territory began to fragment as this armed rebellion expanded and forced the Assad regime from whole parts of the country, or the regime ceded that control because it was in its interests too difficult to hold on to, so it withdrew, and rebel groups and civilians in those areas came under control, set up their own sort of institutions of self-governance, and whole areas of the country here in pink became controlled by rebel groups, while the tan remained areas that remained firmly under the control of the government. Now, when the regime withdrew its forces and its police officers from the ground, they would continue to bomb from above. They were the only force, both the regime and its allies, that had access to the air force to try to coerce those rebel groups into surrender. But you begin to have the fragmentation of the country there. It's how the map looked in March 2013. You can see just two colors, basically, rebel and regime. As time went on, you begin to see more colors, different sorts of groups, especially as the opposition began to fragment. Al-Qaeda forces coming from either Al-Qaeda militants that were in jails and were released in Syria, or those coming from Iraq, develop a presence, first declaring themselves as the Nusra Front, which now has become Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and so forth. So what you begin to have are different sorts of groups. Kurdish groups, also in the area of the northeast where they were traditionally strongest, also forming militias as different groups form militias. So you begin to have small Kurdish areas under blue. this pink becoming areas that remain under rebel control, with other areas of pink being reconquered and taken back by the regime, slipping from rebel control back to regime control. And this bright pink, by 2014, the Islamic State, which emerges, declares itself a caliphate, an Islamic State, a governing entity in northeast Syria, and then spilling over the border into Iraq as well. By March 2016, you see here the Islamic State still remains in pink. These maps aren't totally accurate. It's much more fragmented than that, and it sort of reveals as big blocks things that are much more blotchy, but it gives you some sense. You have Kurdish groups in the northeast establishing control where the Islamic Caliphate has been defeated in that areas, and the continuing sort of expansion of mixed control groups and other areas that was once pink seeding to different types of colors. By February 2018, this is what the map looks like. The larger swath of groups that are under, again, what's a shorthand to call Kurdish groups. As you're hearing now in the news, the group is known as the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is a conglomerate of both Kurds and Arabs from the northeast area, but led by, and the backbone being, the dominant force being Kurdish-dominated militias. The Islamic State having been defeated except for a few small patches, which then were conclusively defeated by the following year. These pink splotches of the Islamic State here. And the big thing to notice is that area of tan, of areas of regime control expanding and expanding and taking back whole parts of the country that had slipped from its control in earlier eras. This is where things looked like until about 10 days ago, when things changed again. What you see is the larger area of the regime having really won back, especially key areas like Aleppo, the Damascus suburbs that had been under rebel control, through various means winning back militarily that territory. The Islamic State shrunk to where there are still sleeper cells, but as an entity no longer existing governing territory. The sort of salmon color of where rebel groups are still strong, and this large area of Kurdish-led autonomy. Now, the sort of salmon color in the north are rebel groups supported and some actively financed and trained by Turkey, which is right there on the border, nervous about its border territory. What we've had in the last 10 days is after President Trump's announcement that U.S. forces near that, in the northeast Syria, near the Turkish border, would be moved. Turkey, which sees these Kurdish-led groups as an outfit of the PKK, a Kurdish armed group, declared a terrorist group that has been waging a kind of armed insurrection against Turkey or armed resistance against Turkey since the 1980s. It sees Kurdish autonomy, especially by an affiliate of the PKK, so close to its border, on its border, as being an intolerable threat to Turkish security, has come in this invasion basically from Turkey 20 miles from the Turkish border into Syria, from that pink all the way to the Iraqi border, wanting that to be a kind of safe zone where there would be no Kurdish-led forces on Turkey's border. The Kurdish forces, in desperation, no longer able to count on their American allies, have now reached out to the Assad regime and to its backer, Russia, to come in to help it protect it from what it fears would be genocidal violence by the Turks. So this whole blue area is now under contestation. It's changing hands from Kurdish to perhaps Russian to Assad. All of this is this new mix of contestation between Turkey, the Assad regime, Russia, and the Kurdish forces as the US sort of leaves and creates a new vacuum and contestation. Got it? Sorta? Don't worry, it's not going anywhere. You guys can continue to follow the news for the near future. Okay, let's move back to some stories to put this all into more human context. What has this been like for civilians caught in war? What is it like to live this experience of war? In the stories that I've gathered, what I see is almost kind of two contradictory experiences of war. On the one hand, living war is terror, ru'b, is the word people would use. People describe living under shelling and bombing. What always struck me is people's stories about how the sounds of war, of hearing bombs or waiting, hearing airplanes and waiting for the bombs to fall were as terrifying as the explosions themselves. There's no way to escape that this is sheer terror. And that's the stories that are coming out from civilians fleeing right now in northeast Syria and from other civilians for the past 8 years. But there's also a kind of normalization to terror that people describe, that you simply get used to the fact that you can die at any time because you have no choice, because there's nowhere else you can go, and the most abnormal gradually becomes normal. A few voices to help us imagine what this normalization of terror is like. Here, Abu Firas from Idlib province in the northwest, that last piece under rebel control, who said, at first, 1 or 2 people were killed, then 20. Then it became normal. If we lost 50 people, we'd say, thank God it's only 50. It's been so long since I heard that someone died of natural causes. Besides this kind of immunity to shock, another aspect of this normalization of violence is humor. There's a lot of satire and humor that's come out of the Syrian war, almost bitter. Here, one example of humor from not an interview I did, but a Facebook post from one of my interviewees one day, who wrote, "The most important and beautiful thing about the revolution is that people rid themselves of the words, 'Hush, the walls have ears.'" To which one of his friends commented, "Yeah, that's true, but there are no more walls left anyway. Everything's gone." So the stories that I've collected follow this arc, what life was like before 2011, this moment of revolution, experiences of war, and the last stage, at least for the people I've come to speak with, is displacement, is becoming a refugee. And the journey they describe of being a refugee is diverse and varied by depending on where people have wound up. So here just that looks like there's a little, that's gotten a little bit messed up, but here to walk you through. At this point, something like over half of the 22 million population of Syria, well over 12 million people, have been forcibly displaced from their home. About 6.8 million are internally displaced. They've had to leave their homes, but still remain inside Syria. And the estimates are about 160,000 people have become internally displaced people in the last 10 days with this renewed fighting. About 5.6 million Syrians are refugees in the Middle East, predominantly the countries right on Syria's border, where you can see some 3.6 million are in Turkey. These numbers are a little bit out of date, but more or less give you a picture. That's part of Turkey's justification in its invasion now, is saying it wants to create a safe zone so it can repatriate and resettle some of its own Syrian refugee population and bring them back to Syria, although that's illegal in international law and actually would be moving people to areas that are very different from the areas they came from. But this refugee issue is lurking behind a lot too. You can see the other numbers in Lebanon, where something like 1 in 4 individuals is a Syrian refugee, the numbers in Jordan and so forth. About 1 million Syrian refugees have made it to Europe. And this puts in perspective about 21,000 Syrian refugees are the full number of those who've been resettled in the United States. So you can just sort of soak in the numbers and where we fit in this global portrait. There are so many, this has gotten a little wacky. Wow, double vision. Okay, so there's so many stories, but one thing that comes through in all the stories I've collected about being a refugee and becoming a refugee is that it's not the beginning of people's journeys. It's not the end of people's journeys. It's just one step along this path, which is why I want to put it in the larger context. So just a few words to give some sense of that. Here is an interview with a woman I did in Berlin. I'm talking about her journey once they took the boat from Turkey to Greece and began walking through Europe, hoping to get to Germany, where they wound up. And she said, "In Greece, we started walking. My husband carried our son the entire 3-week journey. I held our daughter by the hand. Everyone along the way tried to make profits at our expense. My feet bled, and all I wanted to do was sleep. Once, after I got here to Berlin, I met a journalist. She told me, the most important thing now is that you're safe. I told her, but we haven't come looking for safety. We're not afraid of death. And it's true. We don't have a problem with death. Our problem is life without dignity. The last part of the book are reflections, people looking back at this entire pained journey and trying to make sense of it all. And the voices I heard range from anger at what people see as the indifference of the international community, and really a lot of that anger is targeted to the United States, saying people hope the US would have done more, to a kind of nostalgia for a Syria that people fear no longer exists, to hope in spite of it all. As Syrians continue to tell me until today, people are living on hope. People also express lessons. And I'd like to share this final lesson with you from a media organizer named Adam, who looked back with lessons I think that are applied to all of us in thinking about politics, thinking about our own position. And this is what he said. He said, one of the most profound things that I learned from this experience, called the Syrian Civil War, is that the process of finding out what a country needs is never clean. Of course, when you're in a stable country with functioning institutions, it's easy to have a moral code. But these values are only possible because other people did dirty things to put that system in place. We opened a Pandora's box. We had this innocent, childlike interest to see what was inside the box. We thought we'd get a present, and what we got was all the evil in the world. Now we need to close the box again, but it's going to take a while. I see my job as trying to support people who want to make their dreams come true, but I'm too old to dream now. In a month and a half, I'll be 29. So a few final words about all of this, implications for solidarity and for service, especially given the kinds of the beautiful words and the prayer opening about how to be of service to others in the world. There's a lot to think about, but here are some things that I've sort of taken away from my own work that might be principles for you all. One is to never lose sight of the political context. Syria is a humanitarian catastrophe and continues to be. But in trying to meet people's humanitarian needs, we shouldn't forget the larger political context or lose sight of people's political aspirations. And that's just a case for humanitarian charity, but as Noor, the last refugee I quoted, said, Syrians aren't simply searching for life, they want life with dignity, and there's a political component to that. The other is when we're thinking about how to be of service and how to help, that there are a lot of Syrian-led initiatives and priorities out there to support. I'd say if there's one bright spot in all of this Syrian tragedy, it's that many Syrians have founded hundreds of different types of initiatives, whether it's in education or the arts or media. They're forming their own NGOs, they're building networks and projects. And in thinking about how to help, we can look for the work that they're doing, the priorities that they've identified, and try to be allies in the struggle as they identify it. But I would say, for me at least, the most important is simply to listen, that Syrians have traveled a long, dangerous, but also truly courageous journey, simply to be able to tell their own stories, to speak their own truths. In listening to these stories, we shouldn't address Syrians, Syrian refugees in general, with fear or also with pity, but with respect for what they've done and what they've gone through, simply to be able to speak. The very least we can do, I would say, is listen. So I'll end there, which gives us some time for question and answer. Thank you.
So just remind you, if you have a question to ask, please come over here to the microphone. As you know, we have a lot of overflow, and so we want people to hear your question as well as Professor Pearlman's response. Please tell us your name, what you're studying, and then your question. We know at 10 to, some of you will have to leave for class. That's fine. Please just try to do so as quietly as you can. Okay, thank you.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
My name is Dallin Reed. I'm studying political science. My question is, having worked so closely and one-on-one with so many Syrians and refugees, how were you received being from the United States? And what feelings were expressed towards the United States and other European countries that have restrictive immigration policies?
Thank you. So, I mean, it's really remarkable, I would say, how generous people are to me. And this has been my experience not only here, but in 25 years of studying the Middle East and living in Morocco and Egypt and the West Bank and so forth. I feel like people are almost more gracious and hospitable to me as an American than I deserve. So it's really tremendous how people might have huge grievances and criticisms of the government, but open their hearts and their houses and their kitchens as a guest. The hospitality and the graciousness continues to blow me away. That said, the criticism of the American government has been fierce. And I was doing interviews in 2013 when there was the chemical weapons attack and this question of the red line and President Obama administration's debate about whether or not to launch some sort of military strikes. And what I heard from Syrians then, when that did not happen, and in the years since, was a sense of tremendous abandonment, the sense of, you Americans always talk about democracy and human rights, and we risked our lives for democracy and human rights. We are being bombarded from the sky. What can you do against bombs falling from airplanes? And we are being left essentially to our fate, and there's no accountability for a leader that's using not only chemical weapons but every range of brutal means against his people. So there was a sense of abandonment that the United States and the West did not do more to uphold the norm of responsibility to protect, of protection from atrocities. And then from that time, when there was this hope that the U.S. would do something and it didn't, there's almost a sort of disregard of, well, we don't even expect anything anymore from the West. As far as the refugee policies as well, I think there's a lot of gratitude towards countries that have opened their doors more, like Germany has at this point 700 or 800,000 Syrian refugees, Turkey 3.6. Everyone has complaints about their host state and policies in different ways, and sometimes discrimination or bureaucracy or all the whole host of difficulties in their daily lives. But the fact the U.S. is also not shouldering its burden and has accepted so few people, and those numbers are only declining with this real sort of assault on the refugee resettlement program is, I think, disheartening. But for many of the people I talk to, they expect so little of the United States at this point. Our credibility has been, if it was just about destroyed until 10 days ago, now it's taken the final chop, and many people just don't even expect us to live up to the ideals that we seem to claim. Please.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Courtney Scott. I'm a sociology student here studying international development, global women studies, things like that. Thank you so much for your presentation. I just wanted to ask you, you're a big inspiration to me, and what you do is essentially exactly what I want to do. I'm about to graduate, and so I'm wondering, what advice you could give. I mean, you gave great advice about how people could volunteer, but what would you give as far as advice for people that wanted to do this professionally, as a job, as a career, things like that?
Wonderful, thanks. Well, I would happy to talk to you more about it later. I mean, I could say one is I felt like I did many years of listening before I ever felt like I kind of had the right to talk, So that listening is the key, to listen everywhere. Soak in as much as you can until you almost, I feel like a lot of people write op-eds and have opinions and so forth. I like to look at it as something that you earn by first putting in your time, simply listening to what others have to say until you kind of develop intuitions and sensibilities and nuance, and then see the writing is something that you earn by doing a lot of listening. There's more about, I can say much more to you about sort of the ethics of interviewing, and a lot of these folks are totally traumatized, and it can be re-traumatizing to ask questions that take people back to dangerous places. And over the years, I've developed my own sort of strategy, which is essentially doing open-ended interviews in which I don't ask any specific list of questions. because I don't want to put people on the spot and make them feel like they have to answer, even if you say you don't have to answer just by putting it in the room. So I've developed my own strategy, which is essentially starting a conversation, letting the person steer where they want to go, and I'm kind of along for the ride and press where I think will be most interesting to open things up, but otherwise let them steer the conversation. And that has both pros and cons, but any kind of interviewing strategy will have pros and cons. Another thing I've always done over the years is I've always meet someone, usually through another person of trust. I mean, God bless the journalists who had the courage to go up to someone and say, can you give me your opinion? I've always sort of waited so that somebody knows I'm calling because their cousin warned, there's this girl coming from the US and can you sit and talk to her? And like as a favor to their cousin, they'll sit with me. But there are lots of different strategies. I think as long as you have a certain sensitivity of all the sensitivities involved, your sort of moral compass and ethical sensibility will guide you to do this work the best way possible, knowing that there are always trade-offs, and sometimes you'll make decisions that you maybe feel bad about and wonder if you did the right thing. But try your best and let your sort of ethics be your guide. Sure. Thanks.
My name is Diana, and I'm studying international relations with a minor in linguistics. And I just simply wanted to ask you, like, after all your listening and like research on like protesting and why people go out and do it, what has been like the overall theme that maybe you've taken away from all that research, and how have you like applied that into your life?
Oh my gosh, that's a great social science question. When I began this project, my overriding, good poli-sci question in social movement literature was, what explains participation in high-risk dissent? And I started gathering all these stories about protest, and by the end of the day, I was like, I have no idea. My quest for some good poli-sci theory that would explain participation, basically because I wound up with these great human stories, I decided to do work that just sort of showcases the stories, but thinking for some overriding theory, my own quest for looking for that, I felt like I came up empty-handed. I mean, there's still to me something magical about a moment in which people who never protested, who maybe never even imagined protesting, in this situation became ready to risk their lives and go out for a cause. And what that is in the human condition that makes someone do that, I think that there are lots of different triggers and causes, and sometimes it's a sense of responsibility, and sometimes it's a reaction to seeing a terrible price paid by somebody else, and a sense of obligation to a friend who was killed or a cousin who was arrested. And sometimes it's the joyousness of being in that sort of, euphoria of other people, that people sing and dance and feel a kind of collective power. So I think there are lots of things that go on in protest. How any of that can be sort of actionable to motivate people now to get engaged in politics and so forth, I'm not sure, because the Syrian context and the Arab Spring context is so different than the kind of struggles we face here in the United States of like people just seem apathetic and they don't care that that the climate is being destroyed and so forth, and how to get people engaged and want to do service might be it's sort of contextually dependent, and our circumstances here are very different than people who are facing a question of life and death, as opposed to kind of apathy and activization. So I would say the context matters, but there's I'm still looking for the answer to your question about like what are the real takeaways as far as explanation of that kind of moment.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hi, my name is Dalton. I'm a Middle East Studies and Arabic major,
Oh,
and
great.
I also help to run the nonprofit of Their Stories, Our Story on campus to share refugee stories.
Wonderful. Fabulous.
I'll try to phrase this question as best I can, but one of the greatest obstacles in changing the perception of receiving refugees into any country is this stereotype that they will take advantage of welfare, that they'll be a burden, that they won't integrate, that they won't contribute to society in any way. And so there's this, right now in collecting stories, there's a greater emphasis on trying to find the stories of successful integration and success
Absolutely.
stories
Yeah.
and so forth, which there are many.
Absolutely.
But what are your thoughts on respecting the truly horrific experiences that so many refugees have gone through, and also highlighting the successes that they experience? How do you highlight both
Right.
without like disrespecting the other? Is my
Oh,
question.
it's a terrific question, and I can tell in answering the question how much time you've spent with refugee stories that you're getting to this level of nuance past the first sort of superficial cut to the real meat of this. And when I talk to people about refugee experiences, and they're like, we're not devils and we're not angels. We don't all have to be the successful, brain surgeon who came and taught himself Swedish and is now working in a hospital again. I mean, that's and sometimes we're people who make mistakes, or we're just ordinary folks too, and it's almost too much of a burden to expect refugees to have lost everything, suffered tremendous violence, gotten themselves around the world, learned another language, started from scratch, and then become huge entrepreneurs or doctors or
Nobel Peace
engineers.
Prize winner.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And if you're not, I mean, they're normal people like us, and not all of us are brain surgeons or Nobel Prize winners. So, it's something that somehow to bring it down so that people can put themselves in the shoes of these folks and not expect that they have to be extraordinarily everything in order to deserve a place. And I think another thing to emphasize in terms of what you're talking about, this sort of horror that people have suffered, is just the fact that these folks are still alive and still getting out of bed in the morning and still have enough hope to put their kids in school and hope it'll be a better day, shows a kind of strength and resourcefulness and skill that is itself extraordinary without a Nobel Prize and a head surgeon position. So I know it is such a struggle to get those of us who've been so lucky to never have to flee our homes, to never live under bombing, to not watch a relative killed, to not live in fear, to just try to put ourselves in those folks' shoes, to really appreciate the fact that they are still committed to living and hoping tomorrow will be better, is itself so heroic that they actually don't need to do much more of that, I think, in order to deserve our respect. I can say in addition, I also, in so many conversations with refugees, many of them, it's truly painful that they are dependent upon certain kinds of hands out to get started, which of course they need because they don't know the language, they've lost everything, they're starting life afresh. They need a little bit of something to get going, but most want nothing more than to get to the point where they are independent, where they are paying taxes, where they're giving back as thanks for the generosity that they've received. I have not met someone who is not eagerly looking forward to that moment where they're simply independent and have a kind of normalcy. But they need some help to get there. They need some help in the beginning. And we will get back on our investment if we want to think about in economic terms. But I hope we'll also get back in sort of, socially and ethically of what these tremendously resourceful people can bring to enriching our communities.
Thanks so much.
Sure.
Hi, my name's Christian. I'm a Middle East Studies and Arabic major. Like
Wonderful.
Dalton
Great.
here. So I've had a little bit of experience working primarily with Iraqis and Syrians. And in my experience, my very limited experience, albeit, there was this sort of tension and resentment almost from the older Iraqi community with the newer Syrian community coming in. I'm wondering what the perspectives of Syrian refugees are on other refugees. Like, is there that resentment? Is there that tension? Or, on the contrary, is there a lot of solidarity between them?
It's a great question, and also I can see that you're really getting into the nuances of these issues of tension within the community. For sure, I've seen this too in terms of that the older waves of immigrants or refugees see these newcomers, and sometimes I don't know if there's some sort of human thing that gets triggered in which people are worried that that these newcomers are gonna take some of what the old timers have worked hard to establish. That these newcomers are going to maybe make problems, and then the host society will blame all you refugees are the same, or all you Syrians are the same. No, these of us who came in the 80s as students aren't like these new ones. That they're worried that there'll be reputational costs. They are worried that somehow they'll take what's theirs. So there are fears that maybe it's a kind of a pie, and the newcomers will take a piece of it as opposed to expanding it for everyone. So this creates, I've seen these tensions in Europe as well, as some of the newcomers wanting to distance themselves, or the old-timers distancing from the newcomers, or one group distancing from another. I think it's just a fear coming, the lack of resources. There's still fear for people's situations that triggers this sense of maybe this new folks coming in will somehow be bad for me. I'll end up losing. My family will end up losing in some way. And I think the context of that is still fears of discrimination or hostility or racism or Islamophobia or so forth from the larger local society, that people would fear that somehow a newcomer's position would reflect badly on them, that it is a pie that's finite. At the same time, I've seen remarkable solidarity because people need to start from scratch. They need translation, they need help, they need someone who can be a bridge, who understands the current local society but also speaks their language and understands where they're coming from. And immigrants or refugees who've come earlier are perfectly positioned to be that bridge. But they're not necessarily all automatically going to be that bridge, because societies are complicated, and there's all sorts of tensions that emerge, for sure.
Hi, my name's Emma Gleave.
Hi.
I'm a neuroscience major, double minoring in political science and psychology. So I'm super fascinated in trauma and PTSD, which I'm sure is incredibly high among this population. And I'm actually kind of interested in like a career trying to kind of bridge this gap and bringing like greater focus and resources to these populations. But again, kind of similar to Dalton's question, there is this very prevalent tension of wanting to respect and offer while still acknowledge need. So I don't know if you have any insight into like how to navigate maybe some of like the potential stigmas or just kind of bureaucratic barriers to even getting that kind of help to these people.
Oh, I mean, it's a terrific question. So I have a friend in Chicago who is a Syrian psychologist. She came from Syria in 2010 and basically got stuck and couldn't come back. But she is on a mission to talk to other Syrians to say that you should not be afraid or embarrassed to say that you need help, to talk to a psychologist, to seek out resources. And she does talk after talk to Syrian communities, going to mosques, going to in small chats, because most people have come from a place where they're like, what do you think, I'm crazy? I need to go see a psychologist, I'm crazy. And she said, think of what you live for. It is totally natural, it's normal, it's almost inevitable that you have emotions and experiences that you need to work through, but it's a battle, because there's a certain there's certain stereotypes and understandings of that, and I think it's changing over time, because so many Syrians are so hugely burdened. I mean, it was maybe one thing in 20 years ago to say only a crazy person goes to a psychologist. Now it's the point where people are overwhelmed with what they've suffered, whether it's the sheer violence, whether it's the fact that they're now scattered and not seeing their family, who are stranded over multiple different continents, whether it's simply the sadness of, if you identified with a revolution, then that has failed, a political cause, with the sense of having lost a country. Whatever the country they grew up in no longer exists. So everyone is dealing with, one way or another, whether they've recognized it or not. There can't be a person who hasn't some level of tremendous loss. So I don't know the strategies. I mean, trained psychologists are probably better situated to give advice than I am, so I don't want to get into a situation where I'm not qualified. But in my own experience, simply being the best listener you can be, asking people or expecting them to talk, to simply be available to listen for when people are ready to talk, when they build up that trust to talk, when they need to talk, then they can know that people are available and that there's nothing wrong with talking. But there's still a lot of work to go on that issue of stigma.
Okay, quick follow-up question.
Of course, sure, yeah, of course.
So I think just like a big difficulty I've noticed is, so we talked about like the journey of a lot of refugees is so multifaceted, so like the difference between being settled in Germany or Sweden versus in in Greece in a camp.
Yes.
I don't know if you have any information about how to kind of look at implementing like better mental health practices, because I think a lot of the focus seems to be on, like, well, you should just be so grateful that you're here and alive.
Right.
But I think that almost cuts more into the core of the issue, is about personal well-being.
No, absolutely. I mean, because I've spent most of the time the last few years, I spent a lot of time in Germany, where, and I could see the German response to this refugee inflow that was first absolutely focused on the dire practical needs. People need housing.
Yeah.
They need clothing. Then they need papers. Then they need German language. And very slowly later came the sense of, oh yeah, people also need mental health services. And it came a little bit slow that mental health needs are intertwined with all of those other more basic needs. It's not just about a roof and clothing without mental health needs. The person's not going to be able to concentrate in German class, which means they're not going to learn the language, which means they're never going to be able to find a job, which means they're going to have trouble for their families and kids and so forth. So I think it's an approach that intertwine. Mental health issues are not, the third, fourth, sort of a luxury step that you get after you meet the basics. It has to be a part of the very basics, in the sense that it has a chunk in all of there. But otherwise, yeah, people's experiences and I think their mental health needs really vary depending on where they are. Someone who's relatively safe and living in an apartment and starting life again in Denmark, as opposed to someone who's still living in a tent in Greece and just waiting for the hope, not knowing, are they going to be able to get resettled, are they going to be sent back, to people in Lebanon that are in the most horrific of situations, and kids aren't in school, and there's huge problems of child labor and violence, and people afraid to walk down the street, and curfews and so forth for local communities. So it's also wherever people are. I think that, I don't know a Syrian who's not struggling with loss and trauma in one way, but there's a huge range, and that would have to be taken into account in meeting people where they are.
Wonderful, thank you.
Sure, there's a lot more to say in that, for sure. Yeah, please, there's still time, maybe.
My name is Nathaniel Nelson. I'm a mechanical engineering student.
Oh.
And I wanted to ask about, you mentioned how a lot of people felt like the U.S. had failed these people by not supporting them enough. The U.S.'s track record in these sorts of situations, from an American's perspective, we haven't, whether we've done a lot of good or not is kind of up for debate.
Absolutely, yeah.
I realize in the moment that's kind of hard to see, but what sort of practical advice do you have for policymakers in terms of military support, covert support, social, economic interventions that are appropriate? Do you have any insight on what is appropriate and when's too much, and what risk we should take on?
I mean, it's kind of the million dollar question. And I actually just yesterday in Chicago did an event with Ambassador Samantha Power about her memoir, which has a long section about the deliberations within the Obama administration about what to do and what not to do in the politics there. And it is heart-wrenching of different members of the cabinet debating these different scenarios. And I think that the problem is that there'd be good sort of reasons and sound reasons that one could offer for every single possible policy, and their opposites, because it's a situation of unknowns and uncertainty. And every possible track record, whether it's in this case or about interventions in general, carry risks, carrying unknowns. The Syrian situation, I think there was the sense of, if we were to get involved, would the Assad regime fight back? Would his backers, Iran and Russia, fight back? Would it make things worse? And I think that's the question that people ask. Would it make things worse? Will we as a country get bogged down in a quagmire that then becomes years-long operation of state building or so forth, and will we wind up in another Afghanistan or Iraq or Vietnam even? So I think every situation is different depending on their circumstances, but they're all filled with risk and uncertainty, and decision makers have to weigh the risks and the benefits and ultimately ask, is this going to do more harm for the people that we want to serve? Will it do more harm for us? And I was one of, I think, many who think that there should have been some sort of limited U.S. military strike after after the Syrian chemical weapon strike of 2013, that this was an atrocity of violating the norm against chemical weapons, and that had there not been any action, the Assad regime would continue to do even more. It would just be the green light that there's no accountability for any kind of killing of civilians. But understand both that there was not a public opinion mandate for any kind of U.S. intervention. I mean, I think when President Obama turned it over to Congress, it was the sense, it became almost a matter for the American people. And there wasn't any groundswell of support among you and your parents and all of us to get involved in Syria. Had there been, maybe more leadership that made a better case for why this would not simply be Iraq and Afghanistan, that metaphor doesn't exactly apply. Iraq and Afghanistan are all different, and there would be a way to get involved in Syria in a limited way that had accountability for this type of use against civilians, but not get us bogged down. I don't think there's a single rule and single principle, because it's so fraught in the weighing of costs and benefits and forecasting all the worst possible scenarios and judging, how likely are they to proceed. I would just end there saying that, that there are risks of action, but there are also risks of inaction. And I think that the risks of inaction in the Syrian case, we saw to continue to unfold to this humanitarian catastrophe that stands with us until now.
Thank you so much.
No.
Please join me in thanking Mr. Pearlman.
No.